Good morning, friends. Welcome viewers to the CEC live lecture series. And in this series, for the last many months, we've been running a course on world literature. And many countries have been covered, many languages have been brought in. And of course, all this literature that we discuss is available in English translation. Today's topic is Orhan Pamuk, the writer who got Nobel Prize a few years ago, and he was a voice of Turkey, and more than that, he was a voice of humanity as a whole. On this topic, we have as an expert Dr. Richa Bajaj, who teaches English literature in Hindu College, Delhi University. She has done extensive work on literary theory, Indian writing, and also on different aspects of literature elsewhere. Dr. Richa Bajaj has published articles and books, and she is a known person in the academic world today. Before I request Dr. Richa Bajaj to give a lecture, let me tell you, friends, that we are available for discussion on the points that are made here towards the end of the lecture, in the last 10 minutes to be precise. At 10:50, you might call us up and raise your queries. You can ask questions, you can share with us your observations, and Dr. Richa Bajaj would be glad to respond to your queries and other things. The toll-free number that you can use for talking to us here is 1-800-110-430. I repeat, the toll-free number at which you can call us at 10:50 is 1-800-110-430. Now I request Dr. Richa Bajaj to give a lecture. Welcome, Dr. Richa Bajaj, and please give your lecture.
Thank you, Dr. Anand Prakash. Welcome, viewers. Today we are going to speak about, discuss Orhan Pamuk and his works and his overall vision vis-a-vis the novel form that he writes. So, here we will take into account his a couple of essays that he has written, and along with his Nobel Prize lecture. And while discussing these, we will also then discuss to some extent his novel My Name is Red. So, this is the overall this is the overall framework of the lecture today. And why we are choosing Orhan Pamuk is, of course, he's a voice to reckon with. He's an acclaimed novelist, but also because he's from a very interesting region like Turkey. And since it is a part of our lecture series which is on the Middle East, then this particular region also becomes very interesting, because you see it has both the influences of the East and the West, and Turkey is in fact the joining point or the link country that that carries influences of both the Persian and the Western European worlds. And so it's that kind of a blend or a kind of a union that you see where the East actually meets the West, if you could say in that sense. And then what kind of tradition has Turkey had, and since the 15th, 16th century, how life has developed, and also how contemporary Turkey then stands to gain from that tradition, or rather rejects it. It is something that Orhan Pamuk deals with in his works and his essays constantly. So you see, there is this sense in Pamuk. Of course, he's a skillful novelist, in that sense that he has the very sharp acumen of the novelist and use the artistry of the genre in his own way, molding and working on it. But more than that, he offers us a kind of a vision that is required perhaps in the contemporary world today, and also defines, I would say, the writer's place as he sees in the contemporary world. So, to begin with, just to acquaint you in just a line or two about Orhan Pamuk, he was born into an upper class family. So, he belonged to a fairly wealthy family, but he was born in 1952 and he's still around. He got his Nobel Prize in 2006. So, before that, you see, he worked, he tried his hand, he studied architecture also, he tried his hand as painting. So you see, he's almost his visual sense is very keen and very sharp, and that in a way contributes to his to his novelistic kind of techniques that he uses in his novels. So you see, he calls himself a kind of a cultural Muslim. He says that somebody who's involved in the culture of the country, somebody who looks at religion and festivals from the point of view of culture, and not particularly not have a personal kind of a religious belief. So you see, it is this kind of a sensibility that we are looking at. So he has an understanding of architecture. He's also painted. He wanted to become an artist, a painter at one point in time. Then he gave up on that. Finally, he joined the School of Journalism, the university, and then he carried on with his the practice of writing novels. And for a good time, he solely devoted his life to just writing novels. From the age of 20, 22 to 30, he was just constantly doing that without knowing how to publish, etc. So so he aimed to be a novelist actually in this particular sense, and soon he was awarded with the Nobel Prize in Literature in 2006, and it is at this time that he becomes a famous figure to reckon with. And in 2005, in fact, he in an interview had said something about the Armenian Genocide, which took place in around 1915, and what he said at that time, it was not taken well by the ultranationalists in the country, and in fact there was a hate campaign that started against him, and his books were burned. So there is this sense that the artist and the writer also had a brush with reality. That literature is not simply to do with writing entertaining stuff or writing stories, but that it can, and writers can be penalized for what they say and what they write. So in this case, he had a first-hand experience with the kind of violence and the kind of hatred that existed, the kind of divisiveness that existed in Turkey in his own today, in fact, in our own times. So you see, it is this. So in 2005, there was a trial put against him that he had spoken against the he had said that he had spoken about the Armenian Genocide as it took place in Turkey, and how there was an extermination of 1 million people, and Armenians have to flee the country, and this finally settled in different regions such as Russia and even in England and France. So people moved out. So he talks about those areas which became a taboo in society, in Turkish society, those areas which were hushed to silence, and therefore it is a writer. Pamuk is somebody who is constantly dealing with the question of freedom of speech and freedom of expression, and how talking about it is the only way one can come to terms with such instances of the past, and not talking about it can't be the solution. It's like you're hiding another side of you. It's like a character's only the good side of the character comes out. So he was, of course, he was put on trial. There were charges. Then the charges were taken off in 2006, but then again imposed in 2011 or so, and he had to pay some amount of money to close that case. But the idea is that how a writer gets into this kind of a situation, how the politics necessarily gets attached to the literary, so to speak, and particularly so in our present times. And it is this aspect which he is actually exploring in his novels. And The Name Is Red is, in fact, it came out in 1998, and in that novel he actually talks about all these influences, how history, politics, art, love, human emotion, how these actually are so deeply connected, and that you cannot separate one from the other. It is that kind of a vision that Pamuk presents. And so a couple of things that I thought that I should actually point out before or the concerns that you think are there in Pamuk. One very basic concern that he brings out is the idea of a single humanity. It's an idea that he fosters continually in his essays or in his in his works, in his creative works as well. And when he talks about a single humanity, what he means to say is that human beings are essentially very similar, and he says they resemble one another, because my fears, my cries, my suffering is actually very similar to another person's suffering, and we are all in that way united. And here, of course, let me just tell you what he speaks. This is just some portion from his Nobel Prize lecture that just some excerpts from his Nobel Prize lecture, and where he talks about the single humanity point. He says, when a writer shuts himself up in a room for years on end, with this gesture he suggests a single humanity, a world without a center. You see, so what does he mean by a world without a center? He talks about the writer's endeavor in creating a single humanity through the works, through his creative practice, and then goes on to say that because it is a single humanity, therefore there is no center to that world. There is no center to the world. A world without center means that everybody is homogenized in one unit. And is that a possibility? Because for a very long time I thought that perhaps our narratives have changed in the 20th century and the 21st century. It is more about heterogeneity, and it's more about how diverse we are and how to revel in our diversity. And somehow along the line, even writers that have come of late, they have stressed the individuality, they've stressed this heterogeneous kind of living, and focused on those to an extent that somehow the idea of a single humanity in today's literature has vanished. And so when I saw its return in Pamuk, when he actually tries to go through the minds of several characters, and all of them connect with one memory, connect with one image, and how he flips from one character to another, and yet there is a kind of continuity, suggesting that human endeavor and human effort in that sense is quite, in that sense, unifying and is similar. So, this new point about the single humanity point that he actually talks about is something which you don't find in contemporary writing these days, and there is this sense of always highlighting the diverse points or a heterogeneity. In fact, I'd like Dr. Arun Prakash to say something about this idea of a single humanity and whether it is possible in today's world, and what kind of literature is required then to bring out this single humanity point.
No, actually humanity is one and indivisible. You can't separate one person from another. They are part of a framework. This is how I see it, and I think he's right there when he talks about single humanity. We are a part of something which is outside us, and we still have our individuality. So, emphasizing individuality at the cost of singleness, as you rightly point out, is wrong, and we require a kind of daring, intellectual daring, to assert this kind of oneness in the world in the form of human life. Why human life? In fact, human life plus the world around, the natural life, the very earth, all these things are a kind of unified thing, unified reality. So, if a writer today says it, then that person requires courage, because there are, as you rightly say, there is diversity of religions, diversity of beliefs, diversity of all those so-called colors, race, languages, etc. But then the connecting thread is this humanity. And in fact, I wonder why we talk about diversity when we know that the production process, the economic process, the distribution process, the transportation of a thing from one place to another, all these things, and market, all these things are connected. If they are connected, they express the unity of humanity as a whole. So I think he's right, and this requires courage, this requires honesty, and he has, I think, honesty and courage in a good amount in himself.
Yeah, because where he says, in fact, let me quote what he actually says in his Nobel Prize lecture, and he says, "My confidence comes from the belief that all human beings resemble one another, that others carry wounds like mine, that they will therefore understand." So unquote. This is the idea that he's portraying, that human beings actually resemble one another and they carry wounds like I carry my wounds. So suggesting that there is a kind of unity, they're suggesting that experiences are common, that my experience is not necessarily my experience.
In fact, there are people who say in the 20th century that the human language is one.
Right.
There are not many languages, and if you go into the structures of language, then you realize that all languages are actually one human language. So if one is able to project that idea, then one comes closer to others, with whom we have to live and with whom we have to interact.
Right. So in fact, this gets connected with the other idea that Pamuk actually notes, and he says that people ask me often whether if this is my character, if this really happened, and he says I want my characters to, I want to identify with my characters because they are a part of me and yet they are not me. So you see the idea that both things happen simultaneously, that I am those characters and I am not those characters. That idea also suggesting this connects with the, I think, the idea that he's portraying of a single humanity as well.
A very early expression of this idea was there, in English literature in Dr. Johnson,
right,
who talked about Shakespeare, saying, that Shakespeare's kings also are ordinary individuals, kings, queens, the servants, everybody. He said, that Shakespeare is not able to individualize those characters, but puts them as us. So great writers also always have this feeling, that human beings that way have an identity of themselves as a kind of category of life, as a form of life. So why separate one person from another and create enemies, create groups, create interested classes? So let's have just the category of humanity.
Right.
It's a great idea.
Yeah,
no doubt.
And again he uses this idea in a way to connect it with with his writing style, or with the aspect of his creativity, because when he talks about say for instance there is this essay, it's a collection of essays that is titled The Naive and the Sentimental Novelist. It's actually a series of lectures that he delivered that have been published in the form of a book now, and here again he says this idea that I should mention that this great joy of writing and reading novels is obstructed or bypassed by two kinds of readers: completely naive readers who always read a text as an autobiography, and then he goes on to say completely sentimental or reflective readers who think all texts are constructs and fictions anyway, no matter how many times you warn them that they are reading the most candid autobiography. Unquote. So the idea is that all texts for him then are to be seen as autobiographies, and yet at the same time not be seen as autobiographies and as works of fiction. So suggesting that there is this very this kind of literature that is produced is at once common to everybody and belongs to everybody and in every experience, and yet does not. So he's always in that ambiguity. In fact, he says that ambiguity needs to be understood at length, that how we are dealing, that I am and I am not the characters that I portray. And it is this idea that he portrays in this particular essay, that is, Mr. Pamuk, did all this really happen to you?
How do you explain this idea of ambiguity as useful for us?
Useful for us
as a scholar of literature.
Yes, I was trying to relate it actually to the point of humanity, where everybody comes under this one umbrella group that he calls humanity, and where his own experiences are not then limited to his experiences. In fact, dreams overlap, memories overlap, experiences overlap vis-a-vis people. In fact, one story, as I will just also point out in the novel My Name is Red, one story gets defined and told by different people. So again, that narrative technique contributes to the idea that the experience is common to all these people, and that it is whose story are we talking about? Did it really happen? That these are stories then that happen to everybody, but happen to everybody at a very different, in a very different manner. So that is also, and then therefore the story changes in each narrative,
which means
and gets added.
Which means the key word is this thing and yet.
Yeah, so there is this yes and no kind of a ambiguity that he is talking
That's
about.
a significant ambiguity that he's talking
Right.
about.
Yeah, and this also brings me to my the third point that is important in the case of Pamuk, which is to do with memories, which is to do with dreams and memories and stories, how he uses them. In fact, memories are not seen as full stories in the mind or in his works. Memories are seen as pictures, memories are seen as fragments, and how these fragments then are not like they are unconnected. Otherwise you would say that memories as fragments are unconnected. No, these fragments, memories, then constitute series of fragments that are connected in the mind of the person.
So, human beings have individual memories, but when they write, then those memories become collective, they become a part of society through literature.
But memories are also not stories, in Pamuk. They are not like full-length stories that have a beginning and an end. Memories are just pictures. There is a picture that you recreate from. So, and every time there is an idea that you recreate it every time differently. So, a memory is not something that is a stored data in your mind.
If they are fragments, then can they be connected?
Yes, that's what I'm saying. So, the memories actually connect with other memories and connect with more memories, and then they get connected with other stories and experiences, they get connected with dreams. So memories are not pure entities in that sense. They are just a mishmash of many things, and in fact there is that it's in a way in liberating that one is not stuck to that one story.
Does some kind of a pattern emerge from memories which are fragmented?
Yes, so I think fragmented would not be the right word to say. It's a picture or just a piece of memory which fits in many pieces and fits in differently each time you approach that piece. So that is the idea that is there. So the point is that memory is neither linear nor in a form of a story, nor is it a fragment of sort that doesn't have anything to say, that has no baggage. It has other memories associated with the room. In fact, just to understand memory, I could actually point out one instance from the novel My Name is Red, where the character Shekure, she says at one point that, and I quote, "It seems to me that the entire world was like a palace with countless rooms whose doors opened into one another. We were able to pass from one room to the next only by exercising our memories and imaginations. But most of us, in our laziness, rarely exercised these capacities and forever remained in the same room." Unquote. So this says a lot about the idea that Pamuk is constantly dealing with vis-a-vis memory and dreams and imagination.
Suppose I raise the question of the writer there. The writer is surrounded by memories, the writer is surrounded by pictures. Those pictures are there, they belong to other people whom he meets. And this writer then puts the memories together in a kind of narrative. What does he do?
No, but that's the different point. I'll read this again. I wondered, it seems to me that the entire world was like a palace with countless rooms whose doors opened into one another, suggesting that our mind is like a palace with countless rooms and doors opening from one into the other. You are actually leading, so each room is in a way, it becomes a kind of a metaphor for memories that are stored. So one memory leads you to another memory.
What is a palace then?
The palace is the mind. I mean, that, to put it crudely, I don't want to put it in this manner, but then
I was struck by the metaphor that you have so rightly used.
The palace with the countless rooms. What would that suggest?
So
whose doors opened into one another.
First thing is that those rooms are similar to one another,
and their doors are opening into one another. So there is a connection between them.
Yes.
That they are opening. The door is opening both ways. Their rooms are opening. It's not like you entered into the room and you can't come back. So there is always a leap back and forth. So there is a movement in and out. In the sense that doors are places through which opening into one another.
Suppose I extend the metaphor further and say that there are rooms, at the end of the palace. Do they also open outside? I think they do. That's what he seems to be saying.
Yes.
That,
you see, also because
has,
the writer here, because here the character is visualizing the palace also as a world.
Yes.
And she says that the world is like a palace, and which has countless rooms in it, and you can go to different worlds, you can travel different worlds through memories and imagination.
I see.
You know, that is also another point. That is another interpretation that one can take. That the entire world, like a palace with countless rooms, and that you could access, doors opening in and out of them, you can move in and out of those by accessing through memories and imaginations. Where memories don't work, then imagination works.
Which means the structure of the palace has two dimensions, if not more. One is the exact dimension where it exists. The other dimension is the memory, when it moves from the present to the past.
Right.
So there is a past world, there is a present world, and the two are open to each other.
But not just, even in the present world, there are many rooms, there are worlds that we can access through books, as Pamuk would say in his essays as well, that it is through books that you can access worlds that you shut as a writer. In fact, he talks about the predicament of a writer, and he says that a writer needs to shut himself in the world of the books, and then when you enter and you think that you are lonely, but the moment you open a book, you realize that you've entered worlds and that you're not lonely after all. So the idea is that you reach different worlds by accessing either memory or imagination. Where memory doesn't work, then you have imagination to assist you. And then the character Shekure, she continues saying, but most of us in our laziness rarely exercised these capacities and forever remained in the same room. That we don't travel worlds, we don't take help from memory and imagination to travel different areas in life, so, or travel different worlds for that matter. So you see how memory becomes a very enabling device in Pamuk is something that one needs to look at. You know how he very interestingly makes use of memories and imaginations to enter into the minds of characters and to enter in different worlds. And you know, this gives him space to also talk about fantasies, to also bring in fantasies where things become possible, where in life they may not be. So in memories these distortions can take place, and we know the distortions that memory affords, that certain things took place perhaps in one manner, and but you think they took place in another way. So you see, there is this kind of, the element of fantasy gets attached to both memory and imagination, where the writer liberates himself from the ordinary everyday life experiences and just adds shocking details, sometimes amusing details, such as in My Name is Black, there will be a chapter where the dog is speaking, the dog that has been drawn on the page, the dog starts talking to the reader and calls them dear friends. So they're both amusing and at the same time liberating for both the reader and the writer, I think.
I think the viewers would have understood the idea of memory very well with your explanation. Can you say something about imagination and fantasy?
Yes, the imagination and fantasy actually work in a very similar fashion for Pamuk, and it is something that the writer tries to create by adding certain features which are not there in real life.
I think this is a fascinating idea. Literature has many facets, and Dr. Richa Bajaj has suggested that literature is to be continuously interpreted, reinterpreted, seen openly, and that there are many dimensions that are yet to be explored. So we are just in the middle of this discussion, and we have come to the end of the first part of the lecture. I think in the second part, these ideas will be taken forward in order to include still more areas of human life, human experience, human imagination, things like that. And till the second part begins, we have to wait. Thank you. Welcome back, viewers. We begin with the second part of the lecture, and in the first part, Orhan Pamuk was introduced to you through his biographical details, through the work that he wrote, the attitude that he adopted, and then it went into diverse ways to reflect his personality. Now Dr. Richa Bajaj is taking up the points further, and she'll elaborate with the help of details that will be there in the lecture, changing from one moment to another. So now I request Dr. Richa Bajaj to restart the lecture. Welcome, and please begin your lecture.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Anand Prakash. Viewers, we were talking about Pamuk's novelistic technique and his use, the issues, the concerns that he shows. I want to add one more point before I actually start also talking about the novel My Name is Red. That is his use of words as pictures. He actually he creates in his novels pictures through words, and somehow I think his being a painter, his study of the architecture is something that automatically comes into his in his creative process, and in fact he's conscious of this exercise, which is why when he writes his works, then he's always conscious of the word as something that is very which is very fertile and which is also constantly changing. In fact, he says in his Nobel Prize speech, he says that to write is to turn the author's inward gaze into the words, to study the word into which the person passes when he retires into himself. So, the idea that to write is to turn the author's inward gaze into words. So, the author is actually turning his gaze inward into words, and suggesting that he's looking at the shades of words. When you turn your gaze inward into words, then you're suggesting that you're not looking at words from the outside, you're looking at words from the inside. And would that make a difference? And what difference would it make? In fact, when you look at words from the inside and turn your gaze inward vis-a-vis words, then you're saying that you are looking at a different shade of that the words provide, and not go into the traditionally accepted meanings that words are supposed to give. So, to write is to turn an inward gaze into the words is a very interesting idea in itself. What would you say?
No, definitely. He struck through your presentation as a very experimenting kind of an author. He doesn't take things the way they are defined by others. So words for him mean differently than they mean to you or me or to the viewers. So he's a very creative writer.
Right. And he works deftly on his works. He'll keep changing them, and his essays are witness to it, because there he talks about how the process of writing itself, and how he creates. In fact, he says at one place how writing a book is actually about creating a landscape, and a landscape picture. In fact, in one case he actually equates it to writing a novel is like making a Chinese landscape, where
why don't we talk more about it? How to make writing a kind of a landscape?
Yeah,
that's a very interesting
Let
idea.
me read out a portion, and it's called it's from his again collection of essays, The Naive and the Sentimental Novelist, and the essay is titled what our minds do when we read novels. So that's the title of the essay. Of course, these are lectures which were delivered and now they have been converted into
For
essays.
him, lectures and writing are the same thing.
The same, yes, of course. And he's talking in that sense to these are, of course, these are the Norton lectures series that he
is a kind of a writer who considers every human activity as a part of writing.
That's
Would
true.
you agree?
That is true. That is, and arts particularly, you know, and the relevance of art as well is very. He understands the relevance of art and the power of art. In fact,
so for him, there is nothing like art and life. It is art is life.
Yes, and he says it in one of the essays. He actually says that art and life they're intermingled in such a manner that you can't really separate them. In that sense, let me read out this particular extract. He says, when we read a novel, we oscillate between the long view and fleeting moments, general thoughts and specific events, at a speed which no other literary genre can offer. As we gaze at a landscape painting from afar, we suddenly find ourselves among the thoughts of the individual in the landscape and the nuances of the person's mood. This is similar to the way we view a small human figure depicted against crags, rivers, and myriad leaved trees in Chinese landscape paintings. We focus on them and then try to imagine the surrounding landscape through his eyes. Chinese paintings are designed to be read in this manner. Then we realize that the landscape has been composed to reflect the thoughts, emotions and perceptions of the figure within it, unquote. This is the idea that he is giving of a novel, that when we read a novel, then our view is always a short view and a long view. You know, it's a fleeting moment that we read, but then we have the general view, and we are constantly, shifting our focus from one to the other. And then he says that each part of the novel is actually a kind of a landscape where, by details, heaping details upon details, the writer adds to that landscape, the shade, the color, the lines, and then you realize there is an individual in this landscape. You realize there are details, but there is an individual who's placed in these details, and finally, and that individual has a relationship to those details, finally suggesting that all those details are actually seen from the eyes of that person who is in that landscape. That we realize that the landscape has been composed to reflect the thoughts and emotions and perceptions of the figure within it. So that is the idea that he is trying to give here, that these landscapes don't exist because the author is making them. These landscapes exist and have a relation. They exist vis-a-vis the figure who occupies that space in that moment. And he goes on. Let me also quote one more point on this issue. When he talks about the movement of our mind, how our mind is constantly moving in taking the long view and the short view of the novel. He says, I quote, "We continually oscillate between the landscape, the trees, the protagonist's thoughts and the objects they touch, from the objects to the memories they evoke, to other protagonists, and then to the general thought." You see, that is how our mind works when we read a novel, and he says it's a very different exercise. So he's in a way also tried to analyze the working of a novel on a person's mind, and the view that one takes. So when we oscillate between the landscape that we see and the protagonist who is a part of that landscape, then we move to the protagonist's thoughts, and from those thoughts we move to the protagonist's memories, and then we bring in our own memories into it, and then we return to the general train of the narrative.
And it is a continuing process.
And it's a continuing process.
It doesn't stop anywhere.
Yes. So the reader also becomes a part of this exercise of, the thoughts and the memories of the protagonist. They somehow find connection with the thoughts and the memories of the reader.
Literature should not be defined as something, as a printed word which is frozen on the page.
Yes, of course.
This is what the American criticism always says in the post-Second World War period.
Right.
This man goes hammer and tongs at them.
Right.
He says, no, literature is not words there. Literature is a reminder of, is a kind of repository of, it's a reflector of something outside them.
Yes, and in fact in one place, now that you bring the point of literature, he says in his Nobel Prize speech, he says, I believe literature to be the most valuable hoard that humanity has gathered in its quest to understand itself. Unquote. You know, so the idea that it is literature is an exercise in understanding one's own self, and you know, again when you say that it is something, and you know, this idea that everything is interconnected, everything overlaps, etc., it's quite and the idea of adding details upon details, it is something which is coming from that very Eastern sense that is available in the text of Pamuk. And as you said, that American criticism would often focus on the printed word and the text frozen on the page, while for him it comes to life, and it's this kind of intermingling, it is this sense of overlapping sense that literature has. It's a very I think it has got to do it has a very Eastern sense to it. You know, mostly in the East, the cultures that they mix, the way groups merge and mix, and you know, finally what you have is a melting pot where everything comes together.
So structuralism, Bakhtin, all the other people who talk about literature as text, literature as language, go for a toss. So
yeah, because for him, even one structure contains so many structures within it, and these structures will constantly take you to other structures that, you know, you can't. So there is a sense of fluidity and a kind of amorphous nature. Even language in Pamuk is affluent in that sense. There are words and words, and there are for one image, for one idea, for one scene, he will use extensively different kinds of words. That it's like a heap of words, you know, and finally you may feel that they are not needed or required, but then each word adds some kind of a meaning to that narrative. It gets connected to other scenes as well, you know. So it's that way. The exuberance in language also adds to that quality of you know, multiplicity or just fluidity as you see his works.
Which means literature is understanding centered. With the help of literature, you understand life and its complexities, and literature should not be read just for fun or just for, you know, collecting details about things, but about understanding what is goes around oneself.
Yeah, and also understanding oneself, as he says very clearly,
yes.
In, you know, that it's something that it's the best achievement of humankind, in fact, that they have made literature, because that is something, it's a vehicle through which you understand yourself. So that idea of you know, also, and then how he connects it with the novel form and goes on to talk about it.
What is the novel form, by the way, if one can put this question to oneself?
Novel form vis-a-vis Pamuk is something that is, you know, he says it is the only form where which is a longer narrative in the sense that can include you know, both you know, it's a kind of a historical view, and he says that, you know, it's a kind of a history, it's where histories can combine. And for him, then, the novel form is something which is constantly it's not author centric, you know, it's narrator centric, and then also character centric. In fact, you know, if one could talk about the novel form vis-a-vis his novel My Name is Red, I'll just tell you what, let me begin by just telling you what are the chapters titled. And chapter 1 says, I am a corpse. Chapter 2, I am called black. Chapter 3, I am a dog. Chapter 4, I will be called a murderer. Chapter 5, I am your beloved uncle. So you see, the I is something which will constantly define each chapter of this novel. Every chapter starts with I am called black, and the repetition of those, suggesting that each character here gets the opportunity, gets the space to speak one's narrative.
So novel is a classical form then. This is how novel in fact emerged in the 18th century, 19th century. People like Balzac, you know, in the 19th century would always, you know, take novel as a very, very fluid form. And
but you know, in Balzac, or even when we speak of Fielding for that matter, the author is present there. You know, you can always feel the author's presence, and the author in some cases also speaks to the reader, you know. And here the author is negligible. The author is not present anywhere, because it's always the characters, and the characters speak directly to the reader. In fact, it's a very dramatic kind of a novel in one sense. The novel form is very dramatic, because even the dog, when he gets a narrative, he says, "Dear reader, let me tell you one story," etc. So you see, the novel form here is conscious in the sense of the characters and gives primacy to characters, while in Balzac or in other novelists of the 18th century in Europe, you see that they are guiding the course of the narrative. And here the pattern or the kind of connection comes only when the same narrator comes back. So if there is "I am called black," then chapter 22 is "I am called black," then chapter 42 is "I am called black." So the train of that narrative continues, but then the train "I will be called a murderer" again figures in another chapter titled as "I will be called a murderer." So the murderer, then of course it's a murder mystery as well. You see, talking about the novel form first, that this novel actually is a kind of a kaleidoscope in many sense, where your focus keeps on shifting, where each part receives some focus and then it shifts, while the overall plot is the same. The story is there, the story is woven and around these characters by way of their narratives. So that's how the novel form gets defined, and it is also to give voice to all characters. That it's a technique that Pamuk is using in My Name Is Red.
So two words occur to me. The one is freedom.
Right.
Freedom is asserted all the time.
Right.
And the second is that within this freedom there is a kind of continuity.
Right.
And there is a kind of experimentation.
Yes, there is experimentation, and again, his characters become narrators. In fact, in his other novel, The Red-Haired Woman, here this young boy who wants to become a writer and finally goes into digging wells, etc. Again, the narrative begins with "I had wanted to be a writer, but then the events that I'm going to tell you after that, you will realize that how I could not be, and I chose another stream." So the character instantly makes a connection with the reader. You find that the narrative is not like a third person narrative, it is a first person narrative, and a first person narrative that also keeps on changing. It's not one narrator.
What about the audience? Audience also keeps on changing as the narrator is there?
Audience, of course, as readers, you mean?
So the set of readers, there is one set of readers, there is another set of readers.
Right.
There might be a Turkish reader, there might be a European reader. That
of course, the readership also keeps on changing, and now that My Name Is Red is translated into so many languages, and over 60 languages his works have been translated. So of course, it's breaking barriers in that sense, and it is true. But to return to the idea of the novel form as it exists in Pamuk's My Name Is Red, you notice that even objects that you are, or people, you realize that cannot speak. Like in the first, how the narrative begins is the beginning of the novel is with the narrative of a corpse, and he says, "I am a corpse," and let me just read out a couple of lines here. "I am nothing but a corpse now, a body at the bottom of a well. Though I drew my last breath long ago and my heart has stopped beating, no one apart from that vile murderer knows what's happening to me. As for that wretch, he felt for my pulse, listened for my breath to be sure I was dead, and then kicked me in the midriff, carried me to the edge of the well, raised me up and dropped me below. As I fell, my head, which he'd smashed with a stone, broke apart. My face, my forehead and cheeks were crushed, my bones shattered, and my mouth filled with blood." Now again, it's a dead body that is speaking to the reader. So it's in a way shocking. It builds in this idea. It shocks that the reader, how is a dead body talking? Again, what he does with words, he does with images and objects that we otherwise would assume have no space or don't speak to us. So here is a dead man who is talking from under the well and speaking to the reader, and taking us immediately into the fold of the narrative, because it is also a murder mystery.
And as you rightly said, the corpse also is presenting pictures, is presenting memory, is presenting episodes,
right,
and at the same time reminding oneself that one is dead.
Right, and how he moves. So you see, he's reminding that he's dead, and he says, "Oh, you might be interested in knowing how I'm talking, what happens after death, because that's the natural question, and people are interested. I will tell you all that, but first you go and see where is my murderer."
But does he tell all that later?
Yeah, but he doesn't. Of course, he doesn't. About the mysteries of death and birth, he does. He says, you know, it appears I know my soul is struggling somewhere, and it's struggling to break free. But I can't feel anything, but I'm dead, but my soul is still struggling because I have not been buried. So he's using the conventional and the traditional narrative.
He's shaking up the idea of the reader,
right,
by telling him or her something, you know, that one doesn't expect.
Right. Right, that is true. And you know, then again, but again, how he connects. So one, it becomes instantly, because it's a murder mystery, we get attached to the subject, and we want to know who the murderer is, because there is a corpse who's directly talking to the reader. You know, and in one case, when you say nonsense, quite the opposite. I'd even say that souls divided in life merge in the hereafter. So he also gives some philosophical points on life and death, but then, and how he attaches death with politics and religion. You know, as I said, that this novel actually very successfully brings in the personal with you know, the question of artistry and of art with the religious and the political. And he says that my death conceals an appalling conspiracy against our religion, our traditions, and the way we see the world. Open your eyes, discover why the enemies of the life in which you believe, of the life you're living, and of Islam have destroyed me. And you know, he goes on to talk about then the instances that have happened, and what made him, why he died, etc. So you know, it's that kind of, and that
I'm struck, you know, by his comic imagination. He's all the time, you know, active. He's all the time playing with the details in his work, as well as he's playing with the audience.
Right.
And he's enjoying.
Right. So he is enjoying it. There's a kind of joy. You see, also in his essay, when he writes about, particularly even in the Nobel Prize lecture, he says that, you know, the writer has to suffer. The writer has to have patience, but also have that joy of writing, of playing with words, of shaking them up and then rearranging them, and then changing them every now and then. So
he's not a writer of tragedy then?
He is not, no, of course not. It's not a tragedy at all in many ways, even if there are portions where there are two deaths that take place, and there are murder mysteries around who's the murderer, and yet there is a kind of continuity.
There is no helplessness?
There is very little helplessness, in fact.
There is no acceptance of defeat?
No, there is no. In fact, at the end of the novel, this Black, whose love story is also. So this novel is a murder mystery, but this novel is also a kind of a love story between Black, the character who's called I'm called Black, and Shakure, and how he's pining for her towards the end, and at the end he's left crippled. You know, there is an idea that he's going to die, and I would have thought that maybe that would have been some kind of tragedy, because this man who's suffering and his melancholic all through dies, but he doesn't. He turns into a cripple. But then he's he's married to Shakure, and he's still seen as a cripple. So there is no helplessness, there is no defeat, but definitely there is a kind of a crippling effect that is you see in characters, in situations. It's not in itself. You see, he's unable to kill the murderer. So, but the murderer runs away and later is killed by somebody else. But then there is an idea that there is defeat, and yet there is life. So, you know, it's not like he came out as a heroic figure killing the murderer or anything, and yet there is this kind of continuity with life that you see.
So the novel is not experiential. It's a commentatory. It's celebratory. It announces things.
You know, it's like a Pandora's box, where boxes and boxes, they keep on opening and new things keep turning up out of this box, and how he just manages to work around a narrative around whatever comes out of that box.
And the genius is mercurial.
Yes. Okay.
It just moves this way and that way, and creates a pattern out of imagination.
Yeah, so that is the narrative. It moves from different ways, connects dots, and in the beginning it's kind of also difficult to understand what is happening, because there is a dog talking, then there is Satan talking, then there is a picture talking, cops talking, characters talking, and characters also have names. These miniaturists about whom this novel is actually about the Persian miniaturists who are creating a book for the Sultan. And in this book that they are creating, they are they are called Olive, Stork, elegant, not by their real names, but by the names that have been given to them by the master miniaturist Osman, who is building this book for the grand book for the Sultan. And you see also how Pamuk brings in history through this entire endeavor. He is talking about the Ottoman Istanbul, he is talking about the Ottoman Empire in the time of Sultan Murad in 1590s or so, and the change of power also, and the change of seat that takes place in 1595, then in 1603. So you know how the historical details are also made a part of this art oriented novel, because you see all these are miniaturists who are making this book, and in this book is using ideas from the West. It is using the European style of figurative art, which was not favored in in the East or in in Muslim oriented countries. And here then when he is using those art forms, then they are considered to be blasphemous, or they are considered to be going against the idea of their religion, and in doing so people are killed, because there is a threat to them. So you know there is threat, there is apprehension, because what art is doing, what art can do. In fact in one of the cases the character says that, yet does illustrating in a new way signifying a new way of seeing. My grandfather began. This is the reason why they've murdered that poor gilder, despite the fact that he worked in the old style. So just change in the style in which the art form is produced, just illustrating in a different manner, has cost the life of the corpse that we spoke of, elegant effendi. Now this is the idea that art has that power, and how it gets connected to politics and history. So and also talking about the influences of the European countries, especially the Venetian artist, and the Venice seen as a seat of architecture and seat as the center of art, and how Turkey is borrowing those artistic styles from it, and they want to make this book that is made for Sultan, they want to make this book in the manner of that Venetian artists. So suggesting that how this kind of intercultural mingling that is taking place even in art forms, but how it is being received at home in Istanbul. So that is the kind of how art, history and politics, they find a kind of a meeting point in Pamuk's novel.
To me he appears as a generator of power, a generator of passion. And that passion continues all across.
But he's also tracing the history of the miniaturists, the calligraphers, the illustrators, the illuminators of that time, also preserving the culture of that region in many ways.
Culture plus the very nature of art,
right?
The very nature of beauty, because miniaturism means that you are creating a beautiful thing in a small area.
Yes.
So he's very devoted to the idea of beauty and art in his writing.
Right, and that's why he thinks that words are pictures. And he's creating a picture. In many ways he's also trying to create a landscape of that region, and how people live, what they hold dear, how they talk, and along with the history, the politics. So the range is sweeping, actually, in many sense epical in quality.
And I think as you present this writer, it appears that he is presenting the whole world in its specificities, and all of them are put together, and those specific areas, they will interact with one another, but they will be able to retain their individual beauties. So this is what he seems to be saying. He is talking about the earth, he is talking about the planet, in which there are so many varieties, and yet the planet is one. Would you agree with this?
Yes, of course. You see, he's trying to also talking about the mingling of the East and the West, and the way they connect.
So friends, we come to the end of the lecture, in which we have discussed Orhan Pamuk. Dr. Richa Bajaj has given examples from his work. She has given quotations extensively to prove the point, that humanity is supposed to be celebrated in its variety, but mainly in its unity. So this is the kind of paradox, this is the kind of ambiguity that is central to Orhan Pamuk's creativity, and this is to be appreciated. And I think this is a lecture that gives a lot of food for thought, even to the writers, to the alert readers of literature, and this is a kind of lecture which will remain in one's mind for quite some time. So thanks Dr. Bajaj for this lecture, and viewers, read this author with care, with alertness, and if you have completed one book, read another by him in order to see how this writer is able to treat variety. So I hope you have enjoyed the lecture, and thanks Dr. Bajaj again.
Thank you very much.